This is a funny story. Do you remember way back, like 20-something years ago, people would do these videos and reenact the Energizer Bunny? What was these rabbis with Energizer battery packs singing Mashiach, dancing around like for hours on end? So it was one of those kind of things. And I'm like, what is this song? But I want to get into something, and George actually touched on it when he talked about the division of the kingdom of Israel, and it kind of plays into this, and it's something the Lord I've really downloaded to me earlier this week. And I think it's continually expanding, and I'm calling it the fragmentation of the body, and the ministry of reconciliation. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that we are all called to the ministry of reconciliation. Okay? Now, a great part of that is our sharing the gospel and discipling. That's what helps people being reconciled unto God, and that's our role. But it's so much bigger than that. A lot of what we already have been talking about plays into this whole idea, because when we look in especially in the Old Testament, in some of the language that's used, when we see restoration happen, there's also this linguistic part of it in the Hebrew that is it's a circular function, which entails it being reconciled back to as if, where we get the word justification, just as if it never happened, the reconciliation of all things. So the restoration of all things is actually the reconciliation of all things. We're headed, our goal, obviously, is back to the Garden of Eden-like state. I mean, when this is all said and done, and we're in the New Jerusalem, which is the 1,500-mile cube sitting up in the metaphysical nature of heaven, whatever that is, over the geographical area of Jerusalem, we're going to be in that state, in the same state Adam and Eve were in the garden. I believe that's where the garden was, and they were literally, the only way an angel can protect that from being re-entered is if the nature and state of their beings were changed, and we know that by the fact that they aged and they died, right? They took on an absolute fallen human nature at that point of being extricated from the garden. We're going to be reconciled back into that state as those who have come into the kingdom, and we will be in an eternal state, just as if Adam and Eve were. So there's this whole kind of tapestry of reconciliation throughout Scripture. And sometimes I think we miss it because it's in the language. You can see the threading of the Hebrew language, seeing it translated through the Scriptures. But in 1 Kings chapter 12, this is I taught this up at Tel Dan in Israel. And I'm going to hit this, and then we'll get into the slides. But fragmentation is something that comes into play. We see it in today's society in people. Okay, we see it in fragmented thinking. What is fragmented thinking? And fragmented thinking is when our persona, our psyche, has been affected by something, and we begin to separate and disassociate from traumas, from different issues of life, whether it be family issues, whether it be, relational divisions and things of that nature. Very different events. We live in an extremely fragmented society, as demonstrated by the way we live our lives. You can just see it throughout society. Information is fragmented. I mean, even we've moved into this kind of progressive idea in church services where we can have these 1-hour services and they're completely programmed out and fragmented to the point of everything is just, if it's not on time, it's we have to keep everything just, and it's 58 minutes and 27 seconds, and we can't have any more. I mean, everything is just. Do you ever notice how the modern conveniences are trying to train us that we have to have everything just perfect in our lives, to the minute details? I mean, you can't have a can opener. You got to have the most digitalized, Mac Daddy can opener that does that cleans your sink out and all this kind of other stuff, right? I mean, I'm not being facetious. I'm being serious here. It's kind of like this mentality, and it comes from our input. Input in, right? Dr. Allen, input in, input out. Garbage in, garbage out. The basic rules of computer science, right? Whatever you put into it. And our minds are the same way. So we begin to live life this way, and then it puts the lenses on what way we look at things, our relationships, our relationship with God, the false martyr, the guilt complex. All these things are from fragmented issues in our lives. Now just put that in an exponential fashion and allow it to just think about what it does to society. And we live in this society that's fragmented, and we compartmentalize everything. And so here we have the kingdom of Israel, and we have Solomon. What did Solomon do? Well, he had 300 wives and 700 concubines. I don't know how much more fragmented you get when you've got all those girlfriends and all those wives, enough for almost one birthday a day. And you have, it's just mind-blowing, right? So what did that do for his kingdom? I mean, his sons just literally they're watching this. And I get it that, multiple wives was a thing, but 3, 4, not hundreds and all of this. I was in the Philippines several years ago. Karen and I traveled to the Philippines one time, and it was at the behest of one, and this is it. So divorce is illegal in the Philippines, okay? You cannot get divorced. But a man can have as many concubines as they want. The president of the Philippines was President Estrada at the time, and he had his wife and 3 concubines. And the third of the concubines was his favorite, and she had gotten saved and just fell in love with Paul's music and got it to where we had an invitation from the president. We flew first class on Philippine Air all the way to Manila at the behest of the third concubine of the president. And it was just this really weird, just dynamic, and you're talking to her and you're going, okay, I get this, and, we're being entreated by all these business people and I'm thinking to myself, how does this work? I mean, it's just so foreign. It's just I'm so disconnected from an ideal like this. And she says, yeah, my kids are his favorite, and this is the way life is. And businessmen will have a family in Philippines, and they'll have a family in Hong Kong. Very common thing. So they'll have literally 2 families, and it's known through the families. It's not a hidden thing. It's just known. This is the culture. And so, we think about biblical design and models and principles involved in these things, and you go, how is that possible? Well, we see this, and then immediately following Solomon, there is a quest for the throne and a division in the kingdom. This is where we get the 10 tribes that assimilate to the kingdoms of the north, and they lose their identity through generational assimilation. And then we have Benjamin and Judah that kind of make the thread line all the way through. And so what's interesting is the very first thing that happens that's of any consequence is found in 1 Kings chapter 12. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, we have Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and they're fighting over this kingdom, and they both are making mistakes to different degrees. But Jeroboam is seeing that he's losing. He's not going to retain the kingship. And he says in his heart in verse 26, he says in his heart, he's basically given up. He says the kingdom will return to the house of David. So he decides to counterfeit and implement new feast days that coincidentally coincide with the feast of Israel. And if we see in verse 27, this people will go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return Rehoboam to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves. Gee, where did he come up with that idea? And he said to them, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? Behold your God. So what did he do? He put one at Bethel and one in Dan. And actually, we stood at the temple of this golden calf in Tel Dan, right where they burned incense. Now, what's very even more interesting, just as a side note to this, it was about a year and a half, 2 years ago, that some scientists in Israel they found some of the ash of the sacrifices that were made, and they did some very DNA testing, and they found that cannabis was used to burn incense in these pagan altars. Isn't that wild? And what do we have today? We're legalizing this stuff all over our nation. Isn't that interesting? And so this thing became a sin because he set up these two golden calves, obviously. They made them on the high places, and if you study out the high places, there's only 3 kings in all of the annals of Kings and Chronicles that the scriptures will always describe one of the kings as, this king was righteous in the sight of the Lord, and they destroyed the high places. But they neglected to destroy the high places, and most of the time that's the case. The high places, and you've got to think about this through the eyes and the lenses of what it really means, were places of remembrance of pagan deities, because the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was never to be put on an elevated place. It was to be put on the same level as the people, according to Deuteronomy. So when they would elevate these gods and they would put up these pagan gods, there would be times that the king outlawed pagan worship, but he kept the high places. Why would he do that? I mean, it's really a befuddling question. Why would a righteous king who outlawed pagan worship keep the high places in order? Because it's kind of like what we would deem as museums today. All right, they were memorials. They were part of the history of the Israel, and so it didn't seem to be that much of a problem, because it wasn't like people were out there with temple prostitutes and sacrifices and all that. But the problem is they kept the lineage of pagan worship just by the existence. That's why it was important to God that the idols were smashed and destroyed, and that nothing was left of any remembrance of pagan. It says, do not learn the ways of the heathen in Jeremiah. You see, there's an instruction, a direct instruction, do not learn the ways. So anyway, he sets these golden calves up. This is going back to Egypt worship, and it was the gods of prosperity. It was the cattle gods of prosperity, and so of Apis, the bull. And so then he says, he instituted in verse 32, a feast in the 8th month of the 15th day of the month, like the feast which is in Judah. And he went up to the altar. Thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves. Now, he didn't just put idols up, but what comes on the 15th day of the 8th month? Help me out here, folks. What's the 8th month? We've got, of the Hebrew calendar. It's Sukkot. So during Sukkot, he's got 2 calves up, and is not only offering sacrifices to these calves, he's offering them to try to get people on Sukkot to come and worship at the golden calf. How absolutely perverted can you get in the worship of God? Amen? So then they did this at both of these places, and instituted, verse 33 at the bottom, instituted a feast for the sons of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense. So I start with that only because we have a fragmented kingdom at this point. Not only was he doing this for political prowess and trying to win the kingdom back and for him to be the king, he did it in a way as such as to pervert worship, the worship of Yahweh, and bring it into a place of complete apostasy, complete, idol worship. And he was using that to be the leverage for him to become king again. Totally corrupt. We're in full corrupt mode now with Jeroboam. And so now the kingdom divides. All right, so we think, and if you go back, you can go all the way back. The division between the 10 and the 2 goes back a long way. This is just the culmination of all that. The enemy's goal is to always fragment, always separate. George talked about this, how they would, pick up the towns and move them. The enemy's plan is to always fragmentize people from themselves in order to make them more powerless. The enemy's attempt in each one of us is to fragment the way we think, to make us to make us less powerful, powerless in the spirit realm. You have to understand the strategies of the enemy so you know how to fight your spiritual battle. And the really cool thing about that is he's pretty stupid. The great thing about him is he has no foreknowledge, right? He has no now he knows you. He knows your tendencies, knows my tendencies, right? So he can exploit those. But by the same token, he doesn't know what's going to happen 10 minutes from now, right? So he doesn't have that ability. He can only kind of predict. He can guess. The thing is, if we don't allow ourselves to be fragmentized, then what will happen is we will stay strong in the Spirit and the power of His might. We will keep the armor of God on. Why do you think the